This episode is sponsored by viewers like you and the Great Courses Plus. More on that at the end of the video after a bit of fun.
Hey, Cypher here. Hamilton is a fun musical, and, word of warning, I tend to be a bit forgiving of them. But here's the thing, there's a lot of issues with this, and I've got a lot to say about it, as you can probably tell by the timestamp. In the end, I think it makes up for the problems with what it does correctly, but only barely. Stick around for the ride, cause this is super complex. The fact is, the Alexander Hamilton presented in this play is quite divergent from reality, in ways that blatantly whitewash the past in favor of this strange halfway progressivism from the Obama years. Despite its veneer of diverse casting and hip-hop music, it actually represents a revival of deeply conservative, inaccurate, and marginalizing historiography. At the same time, the play does a lot of interesting, new, and relevant things with its attempt to cover a cradle-to-grave story, which is always fraught, of a founding father.
Alexander Hamilton was born out of wedlock in the British West Indies. His father abandoned them despite being of nobility. Still, they weren't poor until his mother died of yellow fever while he was 11 years old. So he had to go work for her ex-husband, who seized all their property. He became quite adept at facilitating trade in the Caribbean, at least until a hurricane devastated the islands in 1772. He penned a letter sermonizing that the disaster was the correction of the deity. Our imagination represents him as an incensed master executing vengeance on the crimes of his servants. It was so well received by the islanders that they pooled money to send him to King's College up in New York City, which is now called Columbia University. He studied there until the Revolutionary War broke out in 1775. First, he joined the New York militia as an artillery officer. Obviously, he was a patriot, even writing publicly in favor of independence, though he remained in town to complete his studies instead of fighting, at least until the British took control of the city a year later. Then he went full-time under the Continental Army. Hamilton fought as an artilleryman, until he started working with his old friend and trading partner, Hercules Mulligan, to gain information about what was going on in New York. Mulligan's slave, Cato, ferried the messages, and Hamilton deciphered them. Through this work, General Washington recognized Hamilton's ability with a pen, so Hamilton became Washington's aide-de-camp. He was basically Washington's right-hand man, writing the orders and various communiques. So he became close friends with John Lorenz and Marquis de Lafayette while they were all wintering in Valley Forge. After that miserable time, they managed to continue the fight long enough to secure an alliance with France. When American prospects were significantly improving in 1780, Hamilton met Elizabeth Schuyler and married her. After some silly quarrel between him and Washington, Hamilton quit to be with his new bride, refusing to rejoin the fight for almost a year. Washington finally convinced him to come back by offering a command of a battalion, thereby promoting him to colonel. Along with his friend Lafayette, they led the two key charges during the decisive Battle of Yorktown. The war was basically over for him, so he returned to New York to become a lawyer. He also handled much of the Schuyler family business, which included slave trading, and quickly ingratiated himself in New York society, even though the British occupation continued for 2 years. During that time, he took his first political role as congressman under the Articles of Confederation. He'd served there off and on for the rest of the 1780s, but the Constitution was clearly broken, so Hamilton was one of the delegates to the creation of the current Constitution in 1787. To campaign for its ratification, he organized a pamphlet-writing effort to argue its case. He recruited James Madison and John Jay to collectively write under the pseudonym Publius. Hamilton wrote most of them, though historians generally consider Madison's number 10 the most important one. Sure enough, the states ratified the Constitution. George Washington, Hamilton's old commander from Virginia, became the first president and appointed Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury for all of his trading prowess. He set to work making a monetary policy that would enfranchise the most powerful elites in the country by centralizing the banking system. The faction forming around Thomas Jefferson fiercely opposed this, because they envisioned an American society surrounding yeoman farmers as the elites instead. Hamilton and Jefferson compromised in 1790, allowing for the first national bank charter and part of the new capital to be in Jefferson's home state of Virginia, though most of it would be in Maryland. The factionalism really broke out surrounding whether to join with France against Britain during the War of the First Coalition in 1793, with Hamilton's Federalists taking the side of neutrality, whereas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans argued for the French alliance. Washington sided with the Federalists, sending John Jay to sign a trade agreement with Britain. Jefferson quit the cabinet and eventually formed his own party, while Hamilton remained until 1795, when he resigned because of the burden of the job. The Treasury was the largest department at the time, and he'd worked tirelessly to establish it. He still wrote Washington's famous farewell address, which denounced the growing party system despite being heavily on the side of the Federalists. Back in New York, Hamilton continued lawyering, but still wrote copious amounts of public letters and pamphlets. When James Monroe confronted him about an affair he had back in 1791, where he paid off a cuckolded husband to continue with his paramour for another year, Hamilton publicly confessed to it in a pamphlet. This halted Hamilton's political prospects for the rest of his life, but he still had influence, especially when he took over leadership of the Society of the Cincinnati, a veterans group of elites from the Revolution, and he eventually used his connections there to gain supreme command of the U.S. Army during the Quasi-War with France. With the rise of factionalism came a huge amount of pettiness. Despite the somber gravitas we often depict the Founding Fathers with today, they were melodramatic prima donnas. They took every little slight as an affront to their honor, hence why duels were so common, including around 12 affairs of honor with Hamilton, though only one carried all the way through to an actual shooting. Not only was Hamilton an elitist bent on currying favor with the wealthy, but his political rivals simply wanted a different kind of elite. So sure enough, local politics in New York dragged him into a bunch of overbloated bickering. A Democratic Republican named Aaron Burr beat his father-in-law, Philip Schuyler, for Senate in 1791. Schuyler beat Burr in 1797 with the help of Hamilton's connections, so Burr decided to form his own club. He started organizing Tammany Hall into a political machine. The rival factions became so beleaguered that Burr fought a duel with Hamilton's brother-in-law, John Church, though no one was injured. Meanwhile, Hamilton fell afoul of John Adams, who thought Hamilton was conspiring against him as head of the Army and Society of the Cincinnati, leading to Adams even firing two of his own cabinet because of their supposed loyalties to Hamilton. The Adams administration was imploding when the bellicose election of 1800 happened, and Hamilton stayed aloof. He had just worked with Burr during a famous murder case that year, but when the electoral votes were tied between Burr and Jefferson, Congress had to decide the tie. Hamilton tacitly supported Jefferson, who became president, and Burr relegated to vice, thereby cementing the rivalry between him and Burr. With all this melodrama, Hamilton was a contentious figure. His firstborn son ended up trying to defend his honor and died from wounds inflicted during a duel. Hamilton did not have to live with the sorrow for very much longer. Burr ran for governor of New York in 1804. Hamilton openly supported Burr's opponent, and during the election, some supposed statements from Hamilton leaked to the press that challenged Burr's honor. They sent a torrent of letters to each other, but Burr was a consummate duelist himself and continued to be unreconciled, despite still holding the position of vice president. Hamilton made his intentions clear when he wrote a public letter stating, "I have resolved, if our interview is conducted in the usual manner, and it pleases God to give me the opportunity, to reserve and throw away my first shot, and I have thoughts even of reserving my second fire, and thus giving a double opportunity to Colonel Burr to pause and to reflect." Technically, throwing away your shot in a duel is called deloping. Now that would make the song a lot less catchy. I'm not gonna delope. I'm not gonna delope. Anyways, it's actually unclear if Hamilton intended to, since he reportedly made it seem like he was going to shoot at Burr on the day through many subtle clues, but he probably deloped just in time for Burr to kill him. The duel made Burr persona non grata with the Jefferson administration and humiliated him. It didn't help that he was heavily in debt, so he hatched a scheme after losing political office to filibuster the West, roughly around American Louisiana and Spanish Texas. The second Jefferson administration found out about it and had him arrested, but the Supreme Court heard the case for treason and Chief Justice John Marshall acquitted him. Burr was so hated that most American cities had effigies burnt of him. He ran to London for a time before returning to die hiding from his creditors under an assumed name on the day of his newer wife divorcing him. His ignominy began by ending Alexander Hamilton's story, the man who made America forever capitalist and a two-party system. As you can guess, what Hamilton represents has been a source of controversy to say the least. Factionalism and capitalism are two things people aren't very likely to praise. The conventional saying goes, "It's not good, but it's the best we've got." In fact, that's kind of how people talk about democracy by saying, democracy is the worst form of government except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. But we invest a lot of nonsense in the founders. Neither the Federalists nor Democratic Republicans were interested in democracy like we know it today. They didn't want to expand the franchise. Most were either in favor of a wealthy upper class controlling the Republic, like the Federalists, or wanted an agrarian society. Hamilton was so opposed to it that he called democracy our real disease. After all, they'd rebelled over taxes. Hamilton was simply furthering that bourgeois revolution by creating a system that ingratiated capitalists toward American society. And despite his untimely demise at the age of 47, he was ultimately successful. When the first national bank charter expired in 1811, it was bought by the wealthiest American at the time, Stephen Girard. He's probably the fourth richest person in American history. Of course, Congress realized their mistake in letting that bank charter lapse, because only a year later, they had to depend on Girard to give them enough credit to fight the War of 1812. Hamilton got his wish though, because that meant Girard stayed loyal to the US. Sure enough, we live in a much more Hamiltonian United States than a Jeffersonian one today. There's been more urban Americans than rural ones since the turn of the 20th century, though neither side of that divide was particularly enamored with the prospect of commoners gaining political freedom. As such, Hamilton has been a symbol of elitism throughout most of US history, someone who toiled for the benefit of capitalists. While he was never a forgotten figure, as even this musical likes to frame him, his legacy certainly did not appeal to most Americans. But times were a-changin'. First came the revisionists, who really emphasized the elitism of the Founding Fathers, describing their flaws as intentional and bereft of morality. Then came the overreaction to the reaction.
For our friends in the press who place a high premium on accuracy, let me say, I did not actually hear George Washington say that.
From the 1980s onward, culture warriors assailed the history profession. Neoconservatives wanted a return to triumphalist orthodoxy, long demurred as inaccurate and purposefully marginalizing. Revisionists had abandoned the idea of a glorious national character, splintering it into race, class, and gender divides. Neocons hated that with a passion and wanted to stuff the genie of historical inclusion back into the bottle. So a new batch of authors arose in the 1990s to redeem the nation from revisionism, called Founders Chic. These folks sought character in the founders, as though scholarship had just frozen in the 1950s, and that Arthur Schlesinger Jr. was the last historian to write on the topic at all. So now they could apply newer storytelling techniques to revive the so often maligned elites. Suffice it to say, this was extremely popular, but also extremely inaccurate. Into that heady mix came the basis for this musical, Ron Chernow's book. It's a classic work of Founders Chic. filled with idealistic whitewashing and mischaracterization for the sake of popular appeal. So we can understand many of the errors the movie makes because it is based on something with so many errors. If you want an excellent book that seems to spend more time highlighting Chernow's problems than the plays, check out Historians on Hamilton, linked in the description. What Chernow's book did was erase Hamilton's elitism, which was so fundamental to his character, all in favor of making him seem like a man of the people. This is where this whole idea came from.
Hey, yo, I'm just like my country, I'm young, scrappy, and hungry, and I'm not throwing away my shot.
That's entirely a mischaracterization, as we will see later. Seemingly unbeknownst to the playwright, Lin-Manuel Miranda, scholarship on the founders did not settle into the cozy orthodoxy of founders chic. American exceptionalism was well and truly dead. Post-revisionism has instead been the actual answer to revisionism. Characterized by a disregard for moralizing and an emphasis on nuance, these historians apply increasingly complex theories to interpret the past and reveal newer and more accurate stories about it. That is where the field is going as a whole, essentially dropping the anachronistic founders chic altogether. But when the musical came out in 2015, it was perfectly calibrated to the Obama-era's neoliberal sensibilities, as in an open disregard for the problems belying systemic oppression for the mere spectacle of representation, with a veneer of possible progress. As we've gone through a very different presidential administration, those issues became more difficult to ignore, but the movie has functioned as a welcome respite from that craziness.
Raise a glass to freedom, something they can never take away.
Despite its ugly ideological underbelly, it hides that influence well, delivering an obligatory dose of triumphalism to a beleaguered 2020 public and stimulating an intense renewal of interest in history. Of course, such renewals always demur once presented with the reality behind the music, many of whom are probably already befuddled by this criticism, and will go no further out of sheer ignorance. To the people saying bullcrap like, "It's just a movie," or whatever, take Miranda's word for it when he says, "I want historians to take this seriously." Now, I would be remiss not to mention the play's other influences. Telling the story of a famous historical figure with a modern musical twist came from Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson. But most importantly was the 1972 film 1776, which I've already reviewed. That's why John Adams doesn't show up as a character in this one. Unfortunately, founders chic was reacting to what that film represents, and so in many ways, that film is much more progressive than this one.
Sit down, John, you fat mother!
What that film did so incredibly well, by addressing new scholarship and examining some real systemic issues, this film utterly fails at. I think the musical somewhat atones for its mistakes, but let's talk about the problems first, before I get to how it counteracts them. Perhaps the root of all the issues in this play is that it attempts a cradle-to-grave story. Rather than narrowing his topic, Lin-Manuel Miranda tried to tell all. With a biography like Hamilton's, that's next to impossible. Even here, where I've got the benefit of voiceover narration, I had to pick my battles. Suffice it to say, there's a lot of time compression. It's also just discombobulated. Like, for the first time, I had to make dueling timelines in order to make sense of all the differences. Yeah, it's that complex. Maybe it's because they're rapping, so the inaccuracies simply come faster, but there are some severe problems with what this musical does. So, I'm going to do a bit of a lightning round, counting up a bunch of smaller and less important inaccuracies, before getting to the tougher issues, because I don't think these quick ones matter all too much.
You punched the bursar. Yes.
Hamilton did not quit King's College. He had to flee because of the British, and in fact, he defended the college's loyalist bursar from an angry mob. The only person in this song that Hamilton met before joining the militia was Mulligan. The rest were acquaintances from his time as Washington's aide-de-camp. Thanks to the wording of the Declaration of Independence and the preceding pamphlet Common Sense, Americans blame King George III for the rise in taxes in the entire Revolutionary War, but he simply acquiesced to Parliament. It was his Parliament, after all. The other issue with this campy performance is that it shows George's insanity when that wouldn't come for years afterwards. I guess you could argue that's just time compression, though.
Some friends, Lawrence, Mulligan, Marquis de Lafayette.
Once again, Hamilton only met Lafayette after becoming Washington's aide-de-camp. Lafayette joined the Continental Army of his own accord before the French intervened, and the reason for that intervention was the spectacular victory at Saratoga, which was led by Benedict Arnold. So this serves to once again erase Arnold's tragic legacy. Also, Burr happened to be at those battles, so they missed a good juxtaposition there. Here is a perfect example of how things happen at oddly mixed up times, because a lot of events happen out of sequence. Eliza and Hamilton met in 1780, but they'll talk about the Battle of Monmouth after this, which actually happened 2 years prior. There's a deeper problem here, but I'm just going to point out that Philip Schuyler had 3 sons.
Instead of me, he promotes Charles Lee.
They seem to pretend that Hamilton was passed by to promote General Lee. At this point, Hamilton was a mere captain, and Lee had been an officer in the French and Indian War, so this claim makes no sense. Furthermore, they skipped right over the fact that Washington court-martialed Lee, so this duel was fought over the fact that Lee kept declaiming Washington for the prosecution, and Washington simply blew him off.
So go home.
Washington did not send Hamilton away. Hamilton quit. Also, he didn't go home, he stayed near the army as he campaigned for his own command. Eliza even joined him there.
But you deserve a chance to meet your son.
Hamilton's first son was born in 1782, and stuff happens after this, such as the Battle of Yorktown, that actually happened before the birth of his first son. Also, the play doesn't talk about Alexander and Eliza Hamilton's other 7 children.
When I was given my first command, I led my men straight into a massacre.
I'm guessing Washington is referring to Braddock's defeat in 1755 here. First of all, he did not lead that. Second, he'd already led 2 expeditions into the Ohio Valley, the second of which sparked off the French and Indian War, though I guess their defense of Fort Necessity could be considered a massacre, but no one would have called it that back then.
This is the first murder trial of a brand new nation.
Hamilton and Burr worked on what's sometimes called the first murder trial in 1800. It's called that purely because this is the first surviving court transcript of a murder trial, so it's a bit misleading. Also, considering this happened in 1800, it's out of place to illustrate Hamilton becoming a lawyer, which he had already been for 2 decades at that point. Hamilton did not propose that Burr write some Federalist Papers. That was Gouverneur Morris. Burr was not a major political figure in 1787, but this is the play amalgamating characters. A lot is invested in Burr despite him not becoming a concern to Hamilton until 1791. They do the same thing with the Reynolds affair. That wasn't Jefferson and Burr, but James Monroe, who was Reynolds' lawyer. It makes a lot of narrative and logistical sense, but keep in mind that's pretty inaccurate.
I have found a wealthy husband who will keep me in comfort for all my days.
Angelica Schuyler was already married by the time she met Hamilton.
I've been fighting for the South alone.
James Madison was not a member of Washington's cabinet, yet Edmund Randolph was there. So Madison functions as an amalgamated character here. Furthermore, there wasn't much to defend for the South. What were they even trying to effect?
Yeah, keep ranting. We know who's really doing the planting.
While Jefferson was a slave owner, Hamilton had traded in slaves himself and benefited from marrying into the slaveholder Schuyler family. New York was a slave state at this time, so this whole standoff doesn't make sense and belies a much deeper problem we'll get to later.
And I just turned 9. I have a sister, but I want a little brother.
He already had 4 siblings.
Lafayette's a smart man, he'll be fine. And before he was your friend, he was mine.
Jefferson befriended Lafayette around the same time as Hamilton and actually met him before Hamilton did. So that's a strange statement. Hamilton quit in 1785 before Adams's administration. He was general of the army from 1799 to 1800, but was not fired. This was not the source of their conflict. Philip Hamilton was not defending his father's honor because of the Reynolds affair, for the pamphlet had already been out for half a decade when this happened. It had to do with George Eaker calling his father a traitor over some political writings. If Eliza did become grief-stricken and separate with Hamilton because of the Reynolds affair, it happened while the whole thing was a secret. She was clearly back to his side by the mid-1790s because they had children together. The pamphlet itself was not a shock to her, perhaps because she already knew. She'd end up burning a lot of correspondence decades later, but I think that's actually a nice homage to the lacking primary sources we have on her. The election of 1800 happened before Philip's fatal duel in 1801, obviously.
You won in a landslide.
By popular vote, Jefferson won in a landslide, but certainly not by electoral votes, which is what this line is referring to. That's not how the system worked prior to the 12th Amendment. There were 4 years between the election of 1800 and the Burr-Hamilton duel, but once again, that's some simple time compression.
Stop! He's already dead!
As you can see, most of these are simply necessary inaccuracies. It is a bit chronologically confused, and there are some blatant mistakes, but for the most part, it does not affect the narrative. Unfortunately, that's not the case for 3 deeper problems. Throughout the movie, Angelica is depicted as being jealous of her sister. Now, Hamilton was certainly a horn dog, hence the whole Reynolds affair, but this is simply salacious pandering. It's been a common tendency of laymen to mistake the common writing affectations of the time with latent sexual energy, but in reality, they wrote in the sentimental style. From the late 16th to early 20th century, you could find all kinds of people writing letters that we would think illustrate some kind of physical affection. It was commonplace for centuries, and only disappeared with the First World War. Since we don't write like that anymore, people just assume they can see hidden relationships because of that old style. This has led to a lot of people mistakenly saying famous people were actually gay without any corroborating evidence other than misinterpreting correspondence. If the play wanted to indulge in this kind of fan fiction, it would do them well to include the people Hamilton employed even more sentimentality in letters with, Marquis de Lafayette and John Lorenz.
Oh yeah, it's a Founding Fathers threesome.
Dear Cleo, people are gonna take that seriously. Though some folks do indeed misinterpret these letters, they are simply not understanding what the sentimental style is. Same goes for Angelica, to the point that Miranda seems to have tried to ignore her marriage to John Barker Church, even though she'd been married to him for 3 years prior to even meeting Hamilton and bore their first son only a year after their marriage. So this entire subplot reveals quite a misunderstanding of primary sources. But the next one is worse. Perhaps the most important interpretive phrase in this play is this:
Immigrants,
We get the job done.
Since Miranda is a Puerto Rican by ethnicity, though he's a native New Yorker, and immigration from Latin America has been such a hot-button topic throughout the last decade, it makes sense that it would have such a bent. Throughout the musical, Hamilton's supposed immigrant background is played as a key interpretive framework.
I shoulder every burden, every disadvantage I've learned to manage. As a kid in the Caribbean, I wished for a war. I knew that I was poor, I knew it was the only way to rise up. Well, I don't have your name, I don't have your titles, I don't have your land, but
immigrant isn't somebody we chose. Oh, this immigrant's keeping us all on our toes.
raised enough for me to book passage on a ship that was New York bound.
How does Hamilton, an arrogant, immigrant, orphan, bastard horse,
Even the key song about avoiding deloping, or throwing away his shot, is preceded with this phrase.
Hey yo, I'm just like my country, I'm young, scrappy, and hungry, and I'm not throwing away my shot.
During a curtain call in 2016, they very publicly used this interpretation to plead with the newly elected vice president to take the pro-diversity message to heart.
We, sir, we are the diverse America, who are alarmed and anxious that your new administration will not protect us.
Unfortunately, this is one of the key misinterpretations from Chernow's book. In no way was Hamilton an immigrant. No one considered him to be, nor did he think of himself as one. When he went to King's College, he did so in the same way that an American today might go to a different state in the Union to go to college. By that logic, I am far more of an immigrant than Hamilton was, given that I now reside in my third state for the sake of college. Moving from one place in the British Empire to another was not seen as immigration. Plus, no one would argue Lafayette was an immigrant.
Turns out we have a secret weapon, an immigrant. You know in love who's unafraid to step in. Everyone give it up for America's favorite fighting Frenchman!
That's just simply out of place. This especially contrasts with Hamilton's actual thoughts on immigration. He said, how extremely unlikely is it that they, as in immigrants, will bring with them the temperate love of liberty, so essential to real republicanism. There may, as to particular individuals, and at particular times, be occasional exceptions to these remarks, yet such is the general rule. Remind you of anyone?
And some, I assume, are good people.
So this is actually the play projecting modern ideals onto a character who certainly didn't hold them. That kind of breaks the entire narrative's back.
Oh, your money!
They essentially whitewashed Alexander Hamilton, and it gets worse. Argue over the definition of whitewashing all you want. This movie making Hamilton out to be anti-slavery will fit that definition perfectly. The Schuylers were a slave-owning family, and Hamilton managed much of their assets. Eliza had a personal slave at the time of their marriage, and since coverture laws were still in effect, that made Hamilton himself a slave owner. This becomes particularly troublesome when the Schuylers are singing about the need for women's rights, all while the chorus positively proclaims the greatness of work.
Listen to my declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And when I meet Thomas Jefferson, I'ma compel him to include women in the sequel.
Them talking about how hard they're working when they're slave owners makes that phrase take on a whole new meaning, doesn't it? Hamilton did not express anti-slavery sentiments. He joined the New York Manumission Society once it formed in 1785, but they merely wanted to help with manumission and end the transatlantic slave trade. In fact, most prominent members of the society were slave owners themselves. He was no abolitionist, and he did not learn the error of his ways. In fact, New York was a slave state his entire life. While they passed an Abolition Act in 1799, it only gradually emancipated slaves who wouldn't gain freedom until 1827. It also indentured their children for 20 years if male and 25 if female. So when the movie says this,
A bunch of revolutionary manumission abolitionists. Give me a position, show me where the ammunition is.
it is blatantly ignoring all of this history. 1776 handled this so well by representing slavery as a system, one in which the North was just as much implicated in it as the South.
Whose fortunes are made in the triangle trade. Hail slavery, the New England dream.
God, what a bastardly bunch we are.
Neoliberalism atomizes individuality so much that people only think of slave owners themselves as inherently evil, rather than part of a system. As a country, we've turned further and further rightward since the crisis of confidence in the 1970s.
It is a crisis of confidence.
And that is why they will follow us
to the right, never to the right, never to the left, forever to the right.
so you can't expect a 2020 movie to be more progressive than one that came out half a century prior. Worse still is how they present Hercules Mulligan.
On the British government, I take the measurements, information, and then I smuggle it.
They had a golden opportunity to show Cato his slave, but instead erased him from the narrative. This is truly whitewashing. Plus, there's so much emphasis on Lorenz's failed scheme to create a black battalion.
Work with Hamilton, we write essays against slavery, and every day's a test of our camaraderie.
Orange is in South Carolina, redefining bravery. We'll never be free until we end slavery.
Black and white soldiers wonder alike if this really means freedom.
As you know, John dreamed of emancipating and recruiting 3,000 men for the first all-black military regiment.
This completely fails to show what he proposed that for. Beginning in Virginia, but eventually elsewhere, the British had a program of recruiting slaves from Patriot owners and freeing them for their service. This is why Lorenz proposed a Patriot version. Of course, they pretend he didn't have enough time to institute such a policy.
His dream of freedom for these men dies with him.
But in reality, that was because the Patriots would not endanger their cause by implementing it. Pennsylvania was the first state to pass gradual abolition, and that was toward the end of the war in 1780. No amount of diverse casting can remove the stain of whitewashing, hence why many historians fiercely denounce this play, especially those who study slavery. But I do think it atones for these issues in several ways. That diverse casting is doing something interesting though. There are two non-Hispanic white actors with speaking parts in this, and one plays a loyalist, while the other plays King George himself. While they certainly fill the role of antagonists, Burr does more directly, who is played by a person of color. This is not some silly kind of colorblind casting, it is doing something narrative-wise. Their race indicates their patriotism. If they are lacking in patriotism, like preaching against the American Revolution, as in Samuel Seabury, then they are portrayed by a white actor. One of the key problems that scholarship over the last half-century has tackled is to decenter the idea of a national character. The idea of some homogeneous identity that makes for a kind of cultural consensus was at the core of Orthodox history. The problem with such a notion is that it inherently marginalizes people. If people are not the majority or seen as carrying the nation by their very physique, then they do not fit the nationalist narrative. At the core of this casting decision is to show that people of color are part of America, and that's truly something special. Movies, plays, or any kind of media, including history, are always products of their time. History is written in the present, hence why saying stuff like, "just tell the past as it was," is inherently ignorant of the entirety of historiography. The writing of history has a history itself. So while there is this problem of trying to represent people who enslaved black people by having them played by people of color, and then apologize for their misdeeds while wearing the face of the very people those misdeeds were perpetrated upon, it also shows the inclusive spirit of recent historiography, if not truly capturing its depth. And the play shows an obsession with not so much history itself, but historiography. It constantly says stuff like this.
You have no control. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story?
We just assume that it happens, but no one else is in the room where it happens.
Let future historians wonder how Eliza reacted when you broke.
The past is up to the present to interpret. It directly addresses what historian Marissa Fuentes calls mutilated historicity. She speaks of how archives reinforce the violence of slavery by perpetuating the erasure of enslaved voices. This film is preoccupied with how and by whom history is told, many of which are the very people the violence of the archives is inflicted upon. It is unfortunate that the basis of this film is from the defunct perspective of Founders Chic and cradle-to-grave storylines, but that's the moment we're in. a time where neoliberalism has atomized individuality so much that we can somehow incorporate culture wars neoconservatism into progressive representation. Along with this hyperfocus on historiography is a great deal of primary sources. Quoting a primary source at length can slow a movie to a crawl in the best of circumstances, but to include this much in a musical, even rapping a few of them, now that's just plain amazing. Here are a few places where they went out of their way to quote stuff.
I anticipate with pleasing expectation that retreat in which I promise myself to realize the sweet enjoyment of partaking.
For purposes of improper speculation, my real crime is an amorous connection with his wife. I had the honor to be your obedient servant.
It even deals with the fact that we lack many of Eliza's letters.
I'm burning the memories, burning the letters that might have redeemed you.
You can appreciate what they're doing when they cite their sources verbally. Even though the plot is all discombobulated, it covers much of what Hamilton did, and that's a lot. You can return to these dueling timelines if you want to get a better picture of the actual timeline, but it doesn't really matter to the narrative, so long as they're there. Plus, the inaccuracies section will help sort you out a little bit. They had to amalgamate and exclude some characters simply because of the limited space of a Broadway production. And it even manages to allude to a lot of other events outside the play. Like, remember this?
That's that little guy who spoke to me all those years ago. What was it, 85? That poor man, they're going to eat him alive.
He's alluding to the fact that Adams was the first US minister to Britain after the war, and he was certainly in for a hell of a time as president. Plus, one thing this play just nails is the dumb pettiness of these interpersonal rivalries. Even if Adams is off screen, we see how nasty it got. Really, the election of 1800 could rival some recent electoral drama for its sheer enmity. Probably the standout moment for me were the cabinet debates. They frame it as a rap battle, and that's just a perfect allegory. Washington simply let them bicker and stood aloof as though judging the arguments. Though he seemed to always back the people who would become the Federalists.
It must be nice to have Washington on your side.
So it would be a mistake to say these parties were sectionally aligned when you realize Washington was basically a Federalist, and the play brilliantly captures these issues. In fact, I dare say this would have been far better if they simply focused on the early Republic, from the Battle of Yorktown to Hamilton's death in 1804, because this is where the play shines brilliantly. Someone managing to make the melodrama of the founders fun and interesting bites back against the turgid sobriety these kinds of things are normally depicted with. And considering booze was one of the main things that the founders consumed, sobriety is definitely something you don't want to depict them with.
Imagine what's gonna happen when you try to tax our whiskey.
Sure, the events are shuffled around, characters amalgamated, much of it mischaracterized, and many obvious mistakes, but it makes up for those problems. Honestly, if Miranda had relied more on other historians, narrowed down the plot, and handled its themes with a bit more ambiguity, especially an appreciation for systemic oppression, we'd be looking at something comparable to that 1776 film. But man, those cabinet meetings are a real stroke of genius. Also, if a film wants to do more with diverse casting, this is a real standout example. Plus, we just need more movies quoting their sources like this. So, yeah. Overall, it's a fun and worthwhile film.
My name is...
What?
My name is... My name is...
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's time to do.
Do you know Gilbert and Sullivan?
Now I'm the model of a modern major general.
I did the basic vegetable animal and mineral. I know the kings of England and I call them fight historical. From Marathon to Waterloo in order to guard.
Sing, Wolf, sing.
Thanks to the Great Courses Plus for sponsoring this episode. They're a subscription streaming service built off of a 1990 venture that records and professionally produces, well, it's in the name, college courses. Essentially, they take university-level lectures, given by prestigious professors in their fields, apply some slick visuals, and generally make the lecture more compelling than even being in the actual classroom, along with giving you access to supplemental course materials. And they cover all kinds of topics, not just history. From philosophical and scientific stuff, to more practical and fun things like beer appreciation or photography. They've got an ever-growing list of lectures for you to watch, and you can do so not only from your computer, but through their Android and Apple apps. Unlike an actual class, you can do this at your own leisure, without an instructor like me making sure whether or not you've learned. There are no tests. It's kinda like auditing a course, but with better production value. And if you click on the link in the description, or go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/thecynicalhistorian, you can start a free trial today. As a perfect companion for this episode, you can check out Joseph Hoffman's course on the Federalist Papers. He goes over the specific implications of those documents, not only for their time, but how they continue to inform our current interpretation of the US Constitution. So go check them out to see that.